Hey guys, what's going on? So today I'm going to be giving you guys some reasons on why I am leaving Sony. I feel like a lot of people, when they talk about Sony, it's more from a perspective of specs and we're talking numbers, but I just want to give more of a practical review on why I'm switching, and the camera I am switching to is the Panasonic S5 Mark IIX. So I'm going to share today why I'm switching and the reasons why I've kind of given up on Sony. The one perspective everybody has with Sony is that it is like the king of video. It's the best camera out there. And honestly, like, I agree. This camera is very versatile, very powerful, has a lot of amazing features that a lot of cameras didn't have before for a while. Panasonic's always had great video features, but the Achilles heel with their cameras is autofocus. I don't use autofocus. Even when I was shooting with Sony, I didn't use autofocus. So that's not why I switched, because the autofocus is a lot better now with Panasonic cameras, but that is not the reason why I switched. So this one's gonna be controversial, but at this point, I feel like I have to say it again. A few years ago, I was at a wedding and I was shooting for about an hour. I finished the bride prep, and then out of nowhere, my camera would do this thing where I would film and then it would just randomly shut off by itself.
When I'm recording and then I just hit stop. Never mind, see right there, it shut itself off even before you didn't even hear the beep. Like, I didn't even stop recording and it shut itself off. The camera literally would, like, the screen would glitch and then it would just reset my camera, turn it off, and turn itself back on.
So I did groom prep, bride prep, and then this was happening to me 20 minutes before the ceremony. I had to get my fiance to drive from our house all the way out to where I was with an A7 IV, brand new out of box, because I didn't understand why my two FX3s were doing the exact same thing. Being at a wedding, I'm like, I don't have time to figure this out. So the bride's walking up the aisle, the groom's walking up the aisle, all these people are walking, and I'm terrified that this camera is just gonna shut off on me and I'm gonna lose all that footage of all these people walking up the aisle. She came up the aisle. I was in panic mode because I had to get to my other FX3 at the other side of the room. I tried to walk past the bride and I completely fell and smashed my 24-105 lens. Here's the lens, guys. I still have it, and this mount broke right off the camera. Now, obviously that's not Sony's problem, but the whole situation with the firmware just had me so rattled that my, $5,000 camera body was doing weird, like, it was a software issue, and I just didn't like that. The reason why I'm bringing this story up is because it's still happening. We're at firmware 5.0 and there's people posting videos about this still happening. And this happened to me a long time ago, and I made a video and a lot of people were thanking me in the comments, talking about, you saved me. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't see this video. And to me, that's just whack. Like, why hasn't Sony addressed it? I've seen content creators who are primarily Sony shooters and they never mention it. I never seen any of them ever mention it. And to me, it just made me feel like, I know I'm getting out, I just didn't know when, but the time is now. I decided I wanted to do YouTube, and I'm like, I don't want to advocate for a camera brand that I can't trust. That was it for me. I was pretty much, from that point, I was plotting and planning when I was going to get out of Sony. It was also just scary, man. It rattled me for the rest of the day. I shot the rest of the wedding on a 35mm prime and a 16-35. Very nerve-wracking, and for me, it just kind of left a really nasty taste in my mouth with Sony. The big issue with the Sony ecosystem when it comes to their lenses is that Sony's G Master glass is really expensive. Every single time I wanted to buy a prime, and if it was a G Master, it's almost like $2,000 I'm shelling out. And I never loved the feel of G Master lenses. The focus rings were fly-by-wire, like they weren't very thick, like the focus ring was very thin, which I wasn't crazy about. If you're gonna buy lenses for Sony, I would go for Sigma. I find Sigma leans a bit more to magenta. Sigma is very sharp. The autofocus works really great with those lenses as well, and they're like a fraction of the cost. That's the first reason why. Another thing is that I just didn't want to buy another Sony body. I've had this camera for 3 years, and if something goes wrong with it, am I willing to go and spend another $5,000 Canadian for another body, another Sony body? And I just kind of said to myself, no. Pretty much I'm selling them while they're still good, while they're still working perfectly fine. And I just found it a good time to kind of get out of Sony. A lot of people say, like, in terms of comparing it to Panasonic, that there's a crop at 4K 60. There's not a crop at 4K 60 on Sony, but there's still a crop when you turn on active stabilization. I like to shoot handheld, and the crop is not, I don't think the crop's 1.5, but there still is a crop as soon as you turn on active stabilization. Not a big deal, but when I would shoot things like real estate, yes, I'd be on a gimbal, I started noticing, oh, I'm like, oh, there is a crop, and it does make a bit of a difference. The FX3 has two base ISOs. They have 640 or 800, I can't remember, and 12,800. To me, it's just kind of like like Sony's flexing on people, because it's like, you're either at 640, or if you want that next really clean image, you gotta go to 12,800, which means you now have to either raise your aperture or crank your shutter, one of the two. I don't want to have to do that just to get to that second base ISO. The Panasonic S5 Mark IIX has dual native ISO 640 and 4000. 4000 to me is more reasonable. I would hope that like you're lighting your scenes, like you're lighting your subjects, you're lighting, because before I had the FX3, I had a GH5S. Yeah, it had dual native ISO as well, but I wasn't like relying on that ISO to like give me light. I never understood when people would shoot with the A7S II and they wouldn't light their scenes just because their camera's capable of doing low light stuff. It still looks like crap. Like, I would definitely recommend, like, even if you have a crazy amount of ISO, I would still light your scenes. It's still gonna look way better if you make your subject pop from the background, you know, in a dark scenario. And I've done that many times at weddings. I'll still set up a light, even though this camera can do some craziness at 12,800. Another thing I want to talk about is that 12,800, I just find that Sony's colors, it looks really soft and a bit muddy in the shadows. I don't know how to explain it. I've heard other people say it too, and I just don't find that the image at 12,800 looks great. It just looks kind of muddy, and I'm just not a fan of that. Another thing I don't like about the FX3 is the dials. One thing I missed a lot about the Lumix cameras is the dial placement. So with the Lumix cameras, you have a dial out here and the whole dial's there. Then you have a dial here and the whole dial's there. I love the feedback, the sound, and even the ISO. Register this as your ISO. It just feels very tactile, and the feedback is just there. Like, it's out of the camera. You can feel it. It's easy to touch, even if you're in a scenario where your hands are sweaty and stuff like that. With the FX3, the dials are like built into the camera, and I just always found like if it was cold outside or was hot outside, these are like very difficult to move. And then this one's like built into the camera. Like, you're only getting half the dial that is exposed. So it's just, I found it was more difficult to press. Same with the ISO one. It's kind of just sits very flat. It's just not popped out of the camera as much as the Lumix camera, which I hated. Another thing to be mindful of is that Sony's like customer service or repair center is in the US. I'm Canadian. I looked at it this way. If this camera has to be fixed for whatever reason, it could be the smallest thing, I could break the screen or something like that, I would have to send this to the US to get it repaired. So the issue I was talking about earlier, the camera would just shut off. One guy updated his camera and he bricked his camera. Then he called Sony and he's asking Sony about how much it's gonna cost to fix. They said it's a minimum of $700. I've seen videos about how Sony handles their customer service, and I don't wanna be on the other end of that. So again, brand trust. I don't have brand trust with Sony, and I've just seen different reasons why I shouldn't, and that's another reason why I'm out. Overall, I think this is a great camera. I think it's a great tool. I think it's a great tool if you're in business and you need a camera that's very versatile. I'm also gonna make a video where I tell you reasons why you should get this camera. So I'm not just here to slam Sony. There are reasons why I am switching, and I wanted to share them, a little real life perspective, my personal perspective. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Subscribe if you want to. If you don't, I mean, that hurts, but I mean, it's okay. But anyway, have a good one.